Welcome back to another lecture of our series Architecture, Archive, Activism. My name is Carsten Ruhl. I'm part of the CCSA, the Center for Critical Studies in Architecture. As you might know, the CCSA is a collaborative project run by the Architecture School in Darmstadt, the Art History Department in Frankfurt, and the German Architecture Museum. As our lecture series is conceived as an open discussion, we are strongly interested in alternative and even challenging perspectives on the archive. Perspectives which might even destabilize common ideas of the archive as something static, monolithic, rational, or even natural. And I think we already had a set of fantastic talks raising some crucial questions in this direction. Not seldomly dealing with the irrationalities of archival thinking and with the uncertain ground on which they are founded, both metaphorically and literally. Anyway, our last lecture before Christmas was built around the Charter 77, a document created in the context of what became known, in Germany at least, as the Prager Frühling. It is proposing different strategies to react against oppression and the regime installed by the Warsaw Pact. As we learned from Hannah Gründler's great talk, that this not only included the systematic use of media, the use of blind spots in the legal system, but of course also education and the creation of counter-narratives or even archives. Memory is primarily regarded here as an act of resistance. We could even say as activism. For those of you who were not able to attend last night, we also had a quite different discussion on a recently completed archive in Cologne designed by Wächter and Wächter architects. Apart from the many information on the project itself, including the paradoxes of the competition, I think it very much helped to understand how the building of an archive is facing quite a number of expectations, challenges, spanning from preservation to urban planning. And soon this led to questions pointing at architectural ideas of the archive and vice versa. For instance, the question what exactly might be considered as the archive's architecture. Is it the infrastructure necessary for the maintenance of an archive, including shelves, archive boxes, climatization, machines, its ordering system, or is it just the building hosting these facilities? However, with the talk today, we are shifting from built archives to written archives, which of course raises new questions. What exactly is a written archive? And is it just another word for what we are used to name as canon? And if so, does that mean that we could also build canons with stones? And to make it even more complicated, how could we describe this assumed relationship when it comes to sources in the field of architectural history? These are, of course, very crucial questions. Questions, among others, we are going to discuss with our today's guest, and we are very happy that Anne Hultzsch accepted our invitation to present parts of her current research. Just let me at least briefly introduce her, and I learned a few minutes ago that she is not a trained art historian, but a trained architect studying architectural history, I think in London. No? That was the beginning of this work. Anne conducted research at a number of excellent architectural schools and universities. She's currently leading a research group at the ETH Zürich, funded by a European Research Council starting grant for the project Women Writing Architecture, Female Experiences of the Build, 1700 to 1900. And previously, she has held positions at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University of Greenwich, New York University, London, as well as Queen Mary University of London. From 2014 to 2018, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Oslo School of Architecture, and recently she received the habilitation at ETH Zurich with the project Architecture in the Public Eye, Buildings, Words and Images in Britain, 1800 to 1950. The range of Anne's research interests is impressive, and I think it would take too much time to get into details. For the moment, it may suffice to mention that some of the questions she's dealing with are how architectural representations can give evidence for the ways in which buildings and spaces have been perceived, interpreted, and reappropriated, how architectural ideas travel through networks of different media, and finally, how this all might have allowed marginalized groups, such as women, to participate in architectural cultures. The talk today is discussing a series of, I suppose, widely unknown texts written by European women since the 18th century as architectural archives. Dear Anne, a warm welcome to Frankfurt and Darmstadt. We're looking forward. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Does the sound okay? I just had an echo.
Yeah, it's okay. Wonderful.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. Well, via Zoom at least. And to be part of this lecture series, which looks really amazing. And I will share my screen now. Is that visible? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So I will talk about texts as archives, as Carsten has introduced. And I'm just going to put a disclaimer straight out there that I'm using that as a metaphor, and that metaphor might be contested. And I'll sort of pick up on that throughout the talk, but I just wanted to put that out there right away, so that we maybe can also discuss this, what effect that has and what's the results of that using this metaphor, and how far can we go with it or not. Okay, so in this talk, I want to explore a series of texts, as Carsten has introduced, written by European women around 1800, as architectural archives. And that's important. The texts are not, strictly speaking, unknown. They've been used in other discourse and other disciplines, but not as architectural archives. So this is really the point of it. Sticking to the metaphor, I intend to blow off the dust of long-winded apologies for writing and publishing at all, which all of these women uttered at some point in their text. This was the common mode of justifying trespassing into the male domain of publishing and writing. I will open boxes of surprising views on new and old, iconic and unknown buildings and sites, and then begin to catalogue, and that's important, catalogue women's architectural agency in a time when there wasn't meant to be any, at least in retrospect. That's what we've diagnosed. In the process, I will shelve, at least for a while, the concept of the archival hero, the genius architect, whose estate sat at the center of many architectural collections. Placing center stage, maybe just for today, maybe for a bit longer, the female user and observer of the build. And clearly this could also be another user, observer of the build, who was disenfranchised from the world of professional design. So I will ask, what shifts if we begin to regard documentary writing or reportage? These are the terms that I'm using, documentary writing and reportage, such as travelogues today, but also journalism, domestic manuals, political pamphlets, philosophical essays, as archival depositories of architectural experience and critique. Okay, and I think, oops. Yeah, so this is based on, this draws on the text by Griselda Pollock, which I think the students here will have looked at. The first chapter of her book, Differencing the Canon, Feminist Desire and the Writing of Art's Histories. And I put here this quote where she explains her title, because I think it's really important to think about this carefully, and because she's put it very purposefully there, as one does when one chooses a title. So she says, my title uses the active verbal form, differencing the canon, rather than the noun difference and or in the canon, to stress the active rereading and reworking of that which is visible and authorized in the spaces of representation, in order to articulate that which, while repressed, is always present as its structuring other. So there are several important things in there. So first, there's this active verbal form that we need to active reread. So differencing is a form of rereading, reworking, reading across, reading against the grain. There's all those sorts of metaphors that she uses throughout the book. And just looking at the contents page, you will find a few of those in the chapters that she presents. And then it's that she says that the other, the repressed, that what's not there, what's not in the canon, is always there. It's not that it's not there. It's not that it's not somewhere there. It's there as the constitute of other. So the canon is always defined by the other. So we just need to find it, make it visible, listen to it. And these are, again, metaphors that I will be using throughout. So for today, I see the canon as something that we cannot avoid while working in academic institutions, participating in the discourses that we construct, but also something which we should really, and this is fairly informal, but we should not get too hung up about. It should not block us. We should not say we need to rewrite it. We need to find a new canon, or we need to expand it. And we can use it quite loosely, in my opinion. Admitting it's a tool rather than a statute might go some way in differencing it, in seeing it as something malleable and something that we can shape and that we need to look with fresh eyes at for what's there but not seen. So paying heed to what is left out and why also goes a way to difference it. There's a canon of works and their creators, of buildings, sites, and their designers, usually narrated chronologically from prehistory, antiquity, Middle Ages, and so on. This is really tightly related to a Darwinian understanding of history, of industrial and moral progress. And this is also what we need to counter and dissect, read against the grain. And then there is, I think, a canon of practices, and that might be the first to dismantle. At least this is the approach I'm taking. A canon of practices in architecture, for the most by male-dominated practices of production, such as designing, drawing, or building, broadly the Renaissance concept of disegno. So what I propose is to widen the pool of protagonists, of practitioners in architectural historiography by changing the main variable in what we consider as the practice relevant to our work, to our historiography. Rather than referring only to the production of architecture, my work considers practices of reception, reading, writing, critiquing, interpretation, adaptation, and participation that are not directly related to the design process as such. So this is really what's underlying my current project. The group that I'm leading, Women Writing Architecture, Female Perceptions, Female Experiences of the Build in the 18th and 19th century. And we really set out to uncover not women architects, that's fairly often a misunderstanding, I find, but to write histories of architecture as seen through the female eye. So it's very much about the experience, but also the agency that these women might have had by articulating their experiences and critiquing what they experienced. And I think I might have to say a word about this image here that I've put here. It's a very quick doodle that I've done for a previous lecture. And it comes from this quote from Virginia Woolf, which also was part of formulating this project, which really made me think. This is when she imagines a sister, a talented sister to Shakespeare, and what would have happened to her if she had had the same talent and had gone the same way. Anyone who knows her text knows that it didn't end well, her story. And I sort of imagine what would have happened if Gottfried Semper, being based in Zurich now here, Gottfried Semper being the 19th century local hero, one can say, not only local, clearly, what would have happened if, excuse me, if he had had a talented sister. So I've done this little doodle and imagined what would have happened if there had been a Judith Semper. She would clearly have not gone on to be an architect, to say it. But this just as a little show how my thoughts have processed from coming to this project. Okay, back to what we're talking about today, archives. How does all this relate to the archive? Clearly, the archive is central to any kind of historical research. Architectural history is no exception to that. This is where much of what we do happens, must happen, should happen, could happen. Now, this is often in digitized form, especially in the pandemic. Perhaps we've all gone to look at things, material that is digitized, and much has been digitized. And I have used digitized texts enormously over the last 10 years at least. And every time I look at material that I looked at 5 years ago, I realize that there's more being digitized now. So this is also a form of archive that we need to look at. But for today, I want to ask, which archive do we use? And that's really fairly straightforward. You know, what archives do architectural historians use? Do we use archives that are constructed by estates of architects, which is the classic architectural archive? Who is the archivist? What kind of agenda do they go for? Who do they archive for? Not only who do they archive, but also who do they archive for? This also goes along with reading against the grain, not seeing the archive as something that is untouched. I think that's really important. It is catalog, it is boxed up. Someone does something to it, and why, and with what agenda do they come? So is the architectural archive a repository of production, of this disegno, of the practitioner, filled with plans, maybe sketches on napkins? Very, I think everyone is very happy if one finds one of those sketches, and you can draw narrate the whole genesis of a building, how it came to be, rather than how it is. Perhaps correspondence between hero figures. Obviously, I mean architects. So what is the role of the archive in canon making? I think this is what needs to be queried. And what I want to set out today is a hypothesis that writing can be a collection of experiences. Now, the term collection and archive are clearly not the same, and I might use them in a slightly imprecise way at some points during my talk. Again, a disclaimer. So can the practice of archival research as we conduct it as historians, as exploration of a collection, often positioned as an objectively sorted collection that is neutral, that is there to be seen and interpreted, yet inviting close inspection with the promise of discovery? That's always the idea one goes into an archive with, that one finds something that is surprising, that hasn't been seen before. Can we use this kind of approach to help to difference the canon, this combination of knowing that there cannot be a neutral archive, together with this promise of discovery, of surprise, of the unknown, of the seeing for the first time, even if maybe it has been seen before by someone, but seeing it with different eyes? Can we use this as a kind of methodology to widen our approaches to architectural history? Can this serve to make marginal architectural actors visible? And architectural actors, I do not mean architects. I think that's probably clear by now. Those who are never called architects, who nevertheless had a lot to say about built spaces. They might not have had any idea of becoming architects, but they had an opinion on the environments that surrounded them, and critiqued it, documented experience, shaped others' experience, and thus shaped the meaning, the ultimate meaning of the built environment. So what I propose is to think of the archive as a method as well as a site. Okay, now just Carsten just said yesterday that I framed this research a little bit in my previous research, and I think that's actually fairly helpful. It helped me put this together. So here you see sort of the three big projects in which I would group my research. The first one is my first book, Architecture Travelers and Writers, in which I explored the question how the ways buildings are looked at and made sense of change over time. So this is a very old art historic question, which I approached as, trained as an architect, an architecture historian, in a fairly naive way, but hopefully that's a very useful use of this approach. I investigated how we can find out about how experience might change, of modes of experience might change, and I used writing for this. So there's clearly this trail of investigating writing and using language to find out about ways of seeing, perceiving, understanding, conceiving, and perceiving. So I looked at travel writings, chosen ridiculously, I have to say, from a span of 4 centuries and several European countries. And my proposal in this was, and this is still very much the case, that it is language, so the rendering of words into buildings, which offers one of the keys to unlock histories of perception. So if an author uses certain words to describe what they see, for the reader to then reimagine this process of writing and reading, this gives us as historians a glimpse at these modes of perception specific to one moment and place, and perhaps a group of people or one single person. In this book, I looked only at male authors. So John Evelyn, Daniel Defoe, John Bargrave, Tobias Smollett, Goethe, John Ruskin, Nicholas Pevsner. Actually, with Nicholas Pevsner, it all began. I realized then, clearly with hindsight, that my proposal could unlock much more than only the perceptive modes of these widely discussed, one could say, canonical men. It could open a history of architecture that includes voices otherwise unheard, such, for example, as those of women, people of color, and people whose identities not conform in any way to those of past and present societies, but who had access to expressing their voices in some form. And more people than we often give credit for had access to this public expression of their voice. So the next project, which is here represented by the collection The Printed and the Built, was a project that was based at the Oslo School of Architecture. And that looked really at words as well as images. And it looked at the illustrated press. You see there's a wealth of architectural images in the public press. The title picture that you see here is from the L'Illustration, from the French illustrated press in the mid-19th century. It's probably from the 1850s. You see the kind of detail it goes into. This building boom, the big exhibition buildings that were being built at the time were being put on double spread images on these pages. And here really what came to the fore is this entanglement of the printed and the built, which then led later to the project that's on the right, Woman Writing Architecture, Female Experiences of the Built, which I'll talk more about clearly. This image is really what crystallizes this entanglement of the printed and the built, of the printed page and its widening spread, its explosion in terms of numbers and numbers of people who got access to it, and the built environment. Now, this is I purposefully didn't turn this picture around, so you might all sit like this right now, but it was printed like this. This is a picture of a new type of printing press that was exhibited in the Crystal Palace in the 1851 exhibition, a great exhibition in London. And this was the illustrated press printing its own printing process. So showcasing the image of the Crystal Palace, of this new glass building, glass and iron building, new building type, this image of modernity, and then showing its own image in it while being printed. So you see this is a sort of matryoshka-like entanglement, which I could go on and on about, but it really crystallized it in the Crystal Palace, how closely linked together this was. So this new type of architecture was made on the printed page, while the illustrated press, the newspaper, the Illustrated London News, was also made by having access to this kind of imagery to show. So it goes hand in hand. It's a chicken egg thing, I think. Okay, and then I looked at the wider spread of certain publication genres, the encyclopedia, the architecture magazine, really the birth of the architecture magazine, as well as the historical handbook. And that really brought me to think more closely about the emergence of the architectural profession, about the architectural practitioner, and how they related, how they shaped the relationship, formed the relationship to the printed page. That really developed. It wasn't straightforward from the beginning. The first magazines were much broader than architecture magazines that we know today, had a much broader audience, were really targeted at the public, at the general public. And that I found very, very interesting, as well as the very rich urban and architectural iconography that one finds in these publications. These are mastheads from illustrated newspapers from Europe, the US. There's the La Ilustración Española y Americana, so Spanish, but also with a sort of Latin American reach. So you see, the news is linked to the city and to its iconographies. And again, I'm not going to say much more about it, but this brought me to think about the public sphere. Clearly Habermas's thesis, and then the critique of Habermas's thesis of the public sphere and how it would have excluded many people, how it was a bourgeois public sphere, a male white public sphere that came to being through print, but also through this, within this environment of cities that had turned into sets of iconographies. And I put here the quote from Nancy Fraser, which is a response to Habermas's thesis on the public sphere, in which she talks about subaltern counterpublics, which she defines as parallel discursive arenas where members of subordinated social groups invent and circulate counter discourses, which in turn permit them to formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and need. So it occurred to me that we need to look for these counterpublics also in regards to architecture, or more widely to the environment. I started to feel that with this focus on words and images and the power they have always had on the ways in which we perceive, rationalize, experience, are taught to experience, I should say, the designed environment, I could formulate a specific project that went beyond tracing the public sphere. I could look for other publics, for counter publics, for subaltern counter publics. I could break these exclusionary boundaries in retrospective. I found those that did so at the time. So this is also important. It's not that we unearthed something that wasn't there. It is there. We just need to see, we need to listen. And this came also about by reading against the grain, by differencing. So looking, for example, at the Architecture magazine here, this is the first British magazine on purely architectural matters, published from 1834 by John C. Loudon. And just reading it with different eyes, not only looking for the architect, for traces of disegno in it, for architectural practices as we see them now, but for focusing on sentences such as this one here, in which he says in the introduction to it, the object of the Architecture magazine is to improve the public taste in architecture generally by rendering it a more intellectual profession, by recommending it as a fit study for ladies, and by inducing young architects to read, write, and think, as well as to see and draw. All very laudable objectives that probably most architecture magazines would still subscribe to, maybe in a slightly different wording. By recommending as a fit study for ladies, Loudon did not imply that women should study architecture, also because you could not actually study architecture at the time in Britain. There were no architectural schools or universities yet. But by thinking about this, what does this mean? So were women encouraged to read the same text as men? Well, then they might also have had the same access to the same intellectual processes and the same understanding and the same right to critique architecture, indeed the same agency that comes with that kind of critique. Okay, so this brings me now to the actual project that I'm talking about. And these are some of the books that we're reading. And it's really about this approach that Gerda Lerner here has in the 70s formulated. It's nothing new. The true history of women is the history of their ongoing functioning in that mile-defined word on their own terms. So we need to look at this on the terms of these women rather than on what we have in hindsight defined as the terms of being the terms of architecture or an architectural sphere, or a sphere of aesthetics, of aesthetic perception, which plays a lot into this. So here you see this is a rough overview, but there's many genres in here. There's manuals, there's cookbooks, there's magazines, Frauenzeitung, a ladies magazine. There's travel guides, as well as scholarly writing. I'm going to talk about a few of those. These 4 titles here now. So these are the, I'll give you quite a lot. The slides are going to get fairly wordy now. I'm going to give you quotations from these 4 sources and think those through with you and how we can think about them as archives, as architectural archives, or as archives of architectural experience. The first one on the left is the Tagebuch einer Reise durch die Schweiz, a diary of a journey through Switzerland. by Sophie von La Roche. It was published in 1787. The second one is Hester Lynch Piazzi's Observations and Reflections made in the course of a journey through France, Italy, and Germany, published in 1789. So the first one, Sophie von La Roche, is a German author, and the three one on the right, so beginning with Hester Lynch Piazzi, they are all English authors. The third one is probably the most famous author, I would imagine, is Mary Wollstonecraft. And this is a slightly less known text by her, The Letters Written During a Short Residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, published in 1796. And then we have on the right, Maria Graham, also later known by marriage as Lady Calcott. And she has published this journal of a residence in Chile during the year 1822 and a voyage from Chile to Brazil in 1823. It was published in 1824. So you can see that these texts get published quite quickly after the journeys happened. Okay, so why travel? First of all, travel writing is a good source if I want to look for reportage for describing experience, because this is the point of travel writing, then that one documents one's own experience, especially in that period, and how that experience has been formative. This is a project of the Enlightenment, how travel is formative to the construction of the self. Oops, sorry. But also, looking at travel writing is particularly pertinent because travel writing was one of the genres that was most open to women. And this has several reasons. Now, there's two factions in terms of the reception of women's travel writing at the time. I'll probably subdivide that a little bit more, but generally, critics were either generally refusing to read women's travel writing, accepting it as serious sources, both for in terms of aesthetic description, because women were not deemed to be have the qualities, the characteristics, to have aesthetic experiences, to be rational enough to put these experiences into words and reflect on them, and also because they were not deemed to be reliable eyewitnesses. So there's both the aesthetic level, the aesthetic experience level, and then the level of being not reliable eyewitnesses, not to be trusted, because they were subject to too much sensibility, and thus could not be relied on giving an objective report on things they'd seen or things that occurred, which was a very big project of travel writing, that one documented what had occurred for people who could not go to contribute a project of exploration. It's a very imperial project, if let's frame it like that. Yet there were also other critics who argued that this female sensibility, this feminine sensibility, made women particularly well suited for travel writing, because they could experience things in a different way, more thoroughly, maybe more deeply, than male writers. So gender is very important in the reception of travel writing, and most critics would remark on the gender of either positively or negatively in this. The travel writing is also linked to letter writing, and there we come also to this kind of idea of an archive. Letter writing, you see, for example, Mary Wollstonecraft's text is actually entitled Letters. Sophie von La Roche also writes her diary as letters to her children. So there's very often travel writing is framed as letters, as an epistolary form, which was also linked or deemed very suitable for women, because it was linked to the private, to the domestic, and maybe also to something that is less filtered so less rationalized. So again, the feminine sensibility was suited to that. So women could publish and were found publishers, and also found readers, had an audience. So this paid. And that's really important to say as well, that all these texts, these were not projects of women who had too much time on their hands and needed a hobby. these were women who needed to earn a living. They were all privileged. They all had been brought up with more education than probably was had most women had access to at the time. They were all of the middle classes, bourgeois, gut bürgerlich, but they all found themselves at one point or other in the need of earning a living to maintain their family, to maintain themselves, to conduct their projects. They all had intellectual aspirations that probably went beyond the genre of travel writing, and many of them published other things as well that went beyond this sort of remit of feminine sensibility. But they all had to earn money with these texts, and this is what they did as well, and that's really important to point out. Okay, so I'm framing these as architectural reportage, these texts, and I've put here the definition of the Oxford English Dictionary because it's important to think about that as well, especially if we think of them as archives. So the definition of reportage is that it's a description, a describing of events, typically by an observer. So that clearly links to travel. Specifically, the reporting of events for the media, as a public remit. Also a piece of journalistic or factual writing, a literary style or genre that imitates or resembles such writing. And then that which is reported, especially of a person, rumor or gossip, and that might play in as well. But the reporting of events, now when I talk about architectural reportage, I might think, but this is not events, this is static subjects. It might be a landscape, it might be a building, it might be a city, it might be a street, but they are static. But the reportage, this idea of an event is important because I'm talking of experience. I'm not talking about the building as something that's not changing, as an object, as a neutral object. I'm talking about how it is seen, how it is experienced. So that's why a reportage is an important register to think through in these texts. It also implies a certain directionality between author and audience, and thus a clear agency. The woman also, I don't want to frame these women as trailblazers and or eccentric exceptions or as heroines. Another important thing, and that's why it's also important to know that they wrote these texts to earn a living, to make money, as an architect would design a building for a client or something, because this is just your profession, this is what you do, and it might not all be the ultimate dream of what you would want to do. And this is important because it takes these women into a more normal framework rather than being something, an exception, something outstanding, which again, thinking in Pollock's terms, would mean that they would be positioned on the outside. They would be exceptions. They would be eccentric. The eccentric spinsters, which is often very, very often framed when we talk about women in that time that did something that we now see as out of the ordinary. Maybe we need to leave that out and not think about this as being something out of the ordinary, so that we can difference the canon rather than confirm it. Okay, so let's get to it. This is the first extract from Sophie von La Roche's diary in Switzerland. And I'll put here the German quote as it's in the original, but I'll read out the English translation in a minute. Sophie von La Roche is fairly well known in probably more literary spheres. She's generally known as the first German woman novelist. She published the first woman's journal, Pomona für Deutschlands Töchter, Pomona for Germany's daughters. She is probably deserves the title as first woman journalist, although I'm always careful with the first. There might have been others that we have not seen. And she came from a privileged upbringing. She married well. And was exposed to, you could say that she was part of a variety of salons, again, this sort of intellectual discourse. But then after her husband died, she needed to pay for the upkeep of her family herself. And this is when she started publishing. So again, she started writing before. This was clearly what she wanted to do. But then the writing also served to pay for her livelihood and that of her children. Okay, so here's the sentence that she writes when she arrives to a hotel in Strasbourg and looks out of the window. From my window, I see the wonderful tower of the cathedral as my nearest neighbor. I have looked at it with binoculars and marveled at the execution of this bold building. But with an increased movement of the soul, I stood before the two carved figures at the entrance to the side door of the church. Both were made by Sabina Erwin, the daughter of the master builder. The contemplation of the whole construction of the magnificent church increased my respect for her spirit and diligence, for this last quality must always be connected with the first if one wants to produce something great, beautiful, or useful. Sabina, in the spirit of her father, had grasped the bold proportions of one of the most splendid Gothic buildings, and at the same time had shown their own tender taste of a fine feminine soul in the form and garb of these two carved figures. So she talks about the Strasbourg Münster, the same place that had fascinated Goethe in a similar time, but she straight away veers off. She points out to the daringness of the Gothic style, but then she straight away points to this legend of the female builder, female carver who produced. There you see the view of the towers. Probably had not quite that perspective, but something like this. And then she describes these two carved figures that legend says had been carved by Sabina Erwin. Not much is known about her, but just the fact that she points to this woman, so clearly this is her way of seeing, and that she then contrasts the daringness of the Gothic building to the tender taste of a fine feminine soul that made it possible to carve the folds of the cloth in the dress of these two women, and that's what most got to her. This is what moved her soul. This is what she looked at with an increased movement of soul. So this kind of sensibility. I'll leave that here and we'll move on to the next writer, Hester Lynch Piazzi, who was a well-connected lady of the society in England, one could say. She was part of a circle of bluestocking, so a very intellectual circles, enlightened society, had many friends, among them Johnson, the author of the famous dictionary, and others. She was married to someone called Thrale, so she was previously known as Mrs. Thrale, and it's interesting that quite often you find in text when she's referred to still Mrs. Thrale, because her marriage to an Italian artist, which gave her the name Piazzi, was seen as downstepping very much in society and meant that she was excluded from polite circles in London, and she strove from that point on to regain that position. And part of her aims of writing is to regain that position in polite society that she had lost through this love marriage through an Italian artist. She lived in Italy for several years and traveled, and then wrote this book, Observations and Reflections, made from a journey in France, Italy, and Germany. And she clearly claims authority for herself. So in Mantua, she writes that the gentleman who showed us the Ducal Palace seemed himself much struck with its convenience and splendor, but I had seen Versailles, Turin, and Genoa. So she's clearly superior to the man the seeming expert who shows her around, and this is something that repeats again and again. And then this passage in Venice is I find very interesting, also because it was picked up by John Ruskin later on, but to that in a minute. So we'll read this. In Venice, she writes about the Ducal Palace. The Ducal Palace is so beautiful, it were worthwhile almost to cross the Alps to see that and return home again. This is again something very common in travel writing that you say, what's the best? You know, what's the better than anything? So comparisons is very important, and then also ranking of items. This is a claim for authority, and that's why this is important in this context. St. Mark's Church, whose mosaic paintings on the outside are surpassed by no work of art, delights one no less on entering with its numberless rarities, the flooring first, which is all paved with precious stones of the second rank in small squares, not bigger than a playing card, and sometimes less, on which you place your feet without remorse, but not without a very odd sensation, when you find the ground undulated beneath them to represent the waves of the sea and perpetuate marine ideas which prevail in everything at Venice. So again, this is interesting because she thinks about the experience as much as of the materiality, this odd sensation, because the uneven ground in Venice, and many writers have remarked on that. Also John Ruskin, over 50 years later, who interestingly, it survives in his correspondence, was sent this passage from Piazzi's book by his father when he was in Venice, pointing out that, asking whether this was the case, that he thought that this was made in imitation of seaways, this undulating, uneven floor, or whether it was just a cause of natural sinkage. I think, wrote Ruskin in reply, she is quite right about the floor being to imitate waves in St. Mark's. There's no reason for its settling when there's no weight. If it had settled so much under plain pavement, what would it have done under the piers? I think it is a very beautiful intention, and that it was partly intended to be marked for such by the very curious mosaic of the fat lion on the sea and the lean lion on the sand. And then Ruskin also in his text in The Stones of Venice, when he describes St. Mark's, he picks up on the same sensation. He writes, "We feel giddy at the first step we make on the pavement, for it also is of Greek mosaic, waved like the sea." So this is also pointing to this feeling, this physical bodily feeling one has when one walks on floor that's not even if one expects it to be even. And Piazzi is very sharp in her opinions. So as positive and as passionate she was about, as enthusiastic as she was about St. Mark's and Ducal Palace in Venice, she did not like the palace in Caserta near Naples. She writes here, "The drive perhaps pleased us better than the palace, which is a prodigious mass of building indeed, and to my eye appears to cover more space than proud Versailles itself." Again, positioning herself. She's seen Versailles. She knows what she's talking about. She has, she can form a judgment because she's seen it. Court within court and quadrangle within quadrangle. It is an enormous bulk, to be sure, not pile. Pile would be all right, I guess. For it is not high in proportion to the surrounding objects somehow, and being composed all of brick, presents ideas rather of squat solidity than of princely magnificence. Ostentation is expected always to strike, as elegance is known to charm the beholder, and space seldom fails in its immediate effect upon the mind. But here the valley, I might say whole, this house is set in, looks too little for it, and offends one in the same manner as the more beautiful buildings do at Buxton, where from every hill one expects to tumble down upon the new crescent below. So there's a comparison not only to Versailles, but also to a place in England, to Buxton. Importantly, she is able to compare proportions. So she sees it as a big picture. She sort of takes a bird's eye view from it. And she's also able to distinguish, presents herself as capable of distinguishing aesthetic experience. So ostentation is expected always to strike. So being overly something that's showy, that's showing off, is meant to strike you. Elegance is known to charm. So there's different registers of aesthetic experience of what resonates in the beholder. But this doesn't work here. This is her aesthetic critique of it. Okay, moving on to the third author, Mary Wollstonecraft, who's now often called a proto-feminist, because feminism is meant to only have risen over the course of the 19th century. I would say she is a feminist. She certainly supported the cause of women. She published the Vindications of Rights of Women in 1792 as a response to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's assumption about male superiority. She also responded to Edmund Burke's thesis of the beautiful and sublime, and the gendered connotations this had in the Vindication of the Rights of Men in 1790. So she's clearly out there in terms of the intellectual discussion about gender, about the implications of the French Revolution, about how society should be reformed. And she was very much in an environment in which she could express her opinions. And this is, I think, also very important. She was, while suffering from harsh critiques as well, and suffering from reading harsh critiques of her persona and of her character because of being a woman, she also had a large circle of friends and associates in which she could express her opinions very freely, and in which women were very much expected to have an opinion and to reason in an intellectual way. And that's again important. So it was not that she did not have the arena to express these kinds of opinions. Now here I'm looking at her texts, letters written from Scandinavia, and this is a description of a landscape by the sea in the south of Norway. Entering among the cliffs, we were sheltered from the wind. Warm sunbeams began to play, streams to flow, and groves of pines diversified the rocks. Sometimes they became suddenly bare and sublime. Once in particular, after mounting the most terrific precipice, we had to pass through a tremendous defile, which the closing chasm seemed to threaten us with instant destruction, when, turning quickly, verdant meadows and a beautiful lake relieved and charmed my eyes. So this text is very interesting. We could probably talk a lot more about it, but just briefly, so clearly she thinks about the sublime and how she is, as an aesthetic subject, experiencing the sublime in this landscape, in this natural landscape. That's fairly dramatic, but that also lives off contrast. And this contrast is something that she again and again points out. So there's the threat, and then there's the calm meadow, the beauty that charms the eyes. So again, very clearly linking that, and herself being in that position of experiencing it. Then she describes Christiania, what is now Norway, the capital, what is now Oslo. Christiania is a clean, neat city, but it has none of the graces of architecture which ought to keep pace with the refining manners of a people, or the outside of the house will disgrace the inside, giving the beholder an idea of overgrown wealth devoid of taste. Large square wooden houses offend the eye, displaying more than Gothic barbarism. Huge Gothic piles, indeed, exhibit a characteristic sublimity and a wildness of fancy peculiar to the period when they were erected. But size, without grandeur or elegance, has an emphatical stamp of meanness, of poverty of conception, which only a commercial spirit could give. So she's clearly not impressed with the Gothic style. She's clearly not talking about, she's clearly not on the rise of the Gothic revival that began at the time. She's clearly not having it. When she describes slightly later the Chapel of Windsor, she compares it to another Gothic building. And she says how when it was cleaned up, it became really terrible. When I first saw it, the gloom increased its dimensions to the eye by hiding its parts. So there's this idea that, a picturesque idea, if we do not see everything, our imagination is stimulated and it increases the aesthetic pleasure. And then she continues and says, but now it all bursts on the view at once, and the sublimity has vanished before the brush and broom. So this mystery is gone. So we do not see it anymore. The grandeur is nothing to her. It needs that mystery for something that we do not see. And then she says, for it has been whitewashed and scraped till it has become as bright and neat as the pots and pans of a notable housewife's kitchen, which is clearly a nice image. Okay, now the last case study, and then I'm coming to the end, is Maria Graham's diary of a journal of residence in Chile. She then goes on to Brazil, but I'm focusing on the Chilean part here. Maria Graham was a daughter of a Navy officer who had taken much care of the education of his daughter. She had read widely, had been exposed to texts of the Scottish Enlightenment, had been to India before, had published books on India, and married a naval captain, Thomas Graham, who died en route. And with him, she traveled on his boat to South America. And on the approach to Chile, her husband died and she arrived in Chile as a widow, did not return straight away, but took the opportunity to stay by herself for a year in the country that had just turned independent and has now become very important to the historiography of Chile as a nation, which is really interesting. So she's better known in Chile than she is in Europe or in the UK. And in her text, she really records. She has a very scientific approach. She records what she sees. She records things that she knows and that are unknown to her. And architecture is clearly one of those things that she records. And it's really interesting to read her text because this period in Latin American architectural history is one that is very little talked about, because it doesn't fall in the colonial period and it doesn't yet fall in the period in which the École des Beaux-Arts and the French style is starting to influence much of South America, which comes from the 1840s and 50s onwards, and when the new republics had sort of found their feet and the influence of France, of French architects, grows much more. So here she describes a set of potteries. And I'm just going to read parts of it to see how detailed she describes it and how we could do a drawing from it. And this is really important in her writing. The furnace is built a little underground, yet so as to admit a free current of air. The flooring is about 8 feet square and the whole 18 feet high. These are of picturesque forms and scattered over the plain, and gave me the idea of antique tombs, so there are associations arising. On one hand, the river was flowing majestically past the town, beyond the Chococlan, with light evening clouds hanging around its sides and woods burning in different places near the summit. To the east, the Andes, at about the same distance that Mont Blanc is from Geneva, there's again the comparison to something familiar, are seen at the end of a long valley. And then she has this little image here as well. She sketches as well, which is clearly also a project of the picturesque journey that one sketches and writes and puts things into these little vignettes. This is a description of the view of the Cordillera de la Cuesta, so the mountain range that one passes from the coast to Santiago before one then sees the high Andes rising. And these landscape descriptions are important because this is the imperial project to measure and survey these landscapes of the so-called New World. So looking to one side, she sees the long valleys we had passed through, and then looking to the other side, and this I read out now, lies the beautiful plain of Santiago, the high hills which surround the city, and the most magnificent range of mountains in the world, the Cordillera of the Andes, now capped with snow, shooting into the heavens, with masses of cloud rolling in their dark valleys, presented to me a scene I had never beheld equaled. In the foreground, there's a great deal of fine wood, and had there been water in sight, the landscape would have been perfect. There's again an anticlimax, and again, this is something that we find quite often. It's quite often not quite perfect. And I would say that this is to do maybe with a personal disappointment, but probably more of not wanting to claim too much authority, too much, not being out there so much. These women always hold back in their judgment. There's always something, giving a very detailed description of a building technique or of a botanical new variety found, and then saying, but I'm not an expert, I can't actually judge, when they had just judged. So I would put this in the same aesthetic, in the same category of being an aesthetic judge, but not leaning too far out, not to cross that threshold too much. And there you see the image that she puts with the Andes towering into rolling, the clouds rolling and the mountains shooting up. A very active description again, and we should reread that so actively as well as something that's constructed, that she sees, that she dominates as well by describing it. She talks about the original hut of every country, and I'm not going to read this in detail, but there's lots of technical detail in that text. She says how this is constructed, this house, these huts of the poorest peasants that are made of stakes stuck in the ground, how the roof is constructed. It's very technical surveying description. So there's the imperial project of laying that out and having the claim to being the objective eyewitness of seeing that and reporting back. And then she describes houses. Every house she stays in, there's a detailed description of it, and quite often we could draw a plan of it. Here she says, the house in which she's staying in Santiago, like all those to which my eye reached, presented a low white wall with an enormous projecting tiled roof. In the center, a great portal with folding gates, and by it a little tower called the Alto, with windows and a balcony at the top, where I have my apartment. And under it, close by the gate, is the porter's lodge. So we really could draw an elevation of it just by reading that text. And again, that's a important stylistic device to be taken, and an important claim for authority. So what I'm really arguing here is that these women found their voices. They claimed authority. They claimed a public persona. They turned into practitioners of sorts, or critics of sorts. They had aesthetic opinions. That resonated with the aesthetic theories of the time: sublime, the beautiful, das Erhabene, das Malerische. And to return to Pollock here for a minute, I would argue that it was these women and others who already worked to difference the canon. So all we have to do is listen. Maybe we have to archive, we have to catalog, we have to make visible, we have to look and be surprised. Maybe that's our contribution to the project of differencing. And I want to end with this second source here by Mary Louise Pratt, text in which she defined the contact zone, so it might be familiar to some. This book, Imperial Eyes, Travel Writing and Transcorrelation, on which she also discusses Maria Graham, the last author I have discussed here. And she says that this normalizing, homogenizing rhetoric of inequality, this is clearly with a colonial implication, but I think it can be extended to all the cases here. I think that you can read this through a colonial lens, most of these texts. This essentializing discursive power is impervious until those who are seen are also listened to. So this is really what is important. We need to listen to see how these women wrote their own archives. We need to look through those shelves of texts. We need to go and see it. We need to listen to them and make them visible, not only for within that archival box in which modern disciplinarity has placed them, but for all of those who want to speak to it, and also for all the subjects they spoke on, and they did speak very clearly on architecture and the built environment and landscapes. Thank you very much.